Hello, art appreciators. Welcome to the Chapter 2 study guide, which is What is Art? So we're going to talk a lot about art and beauty, appearances, meaning, and objects, and a little bit about artist and audience and how there's a relationship between those two. Let's jump back right in. So the first two key terms that I want to introduce to you guys is aesthetics and then disinterested contemplation. So aesthetics you may have heard before, maybe in the context of like the country kitchen aesthetic or some kind of, it's very popular in those home makeover shows. They use that word a lot. But all that aesthetics really is it's a branch of philosophy that deals with why we like what we like, why we like the feeling of certain textures and why we don't like others, why some people are drawn to certain smells and others are not. Everyone has a aesthetic, and that aesthetic ranges in all kinds of ways about your five senses. So each of your five senses has an aesthetic. This class is obviously going to focus on visual aesthetics more than some of the other aesthetics. And disinterested contemplation is looking beyond the actual to try to find beauty. Right? So let's look at an example of that in action. So this is Cabbage Leaf by Edward Weston, and this artwork is taking something that is by no means considered beautiful, right? A cabbage leaf is not something that we would normally think of as an aesthetic object. But the way it's presented and the way in which he's sort of taken all of the background, all of the context away from it and just presented us with this upside down cabbage leaf allows us to look at it in a new way, to find beauty in something that's not commonly considered beautiful. All right. This brings us to this week's discussion. This is kind of a little screenshot of it. There should be some information on somewhere around page 30. If you have the new textbook, it's page 30. If you have an older one, it might be different. Talking about aesthetics and why we make the choices that we make. So I want you to think and reflect on your own aesthetic, not just your own aesthetic in artwork and the artwork that you would select, but also in maybe other things, other aspects of your life. So just give a little bit of thought to aesthetic and kind of just to give it thought and then share that with the group. All right. Next, I'm going to tell you guys a quick little story about this work, which is The Throne of the Third Heaven by James Hampton. So James Hampton he worked various jobs throughout his life, and he was never trained as an artist. And for most of his life, he worked as a janitor. And the back of the house that he lived in or maybe rented, there was a garage where he built this object, which was a devotional object that he created basically for himself and his own religious beliefs. And this object was never meant to be viewed by anyone. It was never meant to be judged by critics or purchased or anything like that we would normally associate with the economies of art. This was completely outside of that realm and for Hampton only. And it was not until he passed away that they even found this object, and now it resides in, I believe, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So this brings us to our next vocabulary word, new vocabulary word, which is outsider or folk art. And this can include native art and intuitive art. It's any artwork that's created by a non-professional artist for a non-professional, non-academic, non-client, non-patron way. So historically, artists usually worked for clients and patrons, and they often worked collaboratively in workshops. It was not really till the Renaissance that the individual artist with an individual style kind of became a thing in Western art. Up until that point, artists were often unnamed. It's not till we hit the Renaissance that we start hearing about big names like Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael and Jan van Eyck. Those are big names that come about at that time. So that we will talk more about that when we get into the later chapters. All right, so I want you guys to take just a second before we move on and look at these three artworks. They're not in your book, right? So these artworks have something in common, but they're very different ways of exploring that thing that's in common. So just take a moment and think about what it might be that they have in common. And this brings us to our next kind of big group, right, which is the basic styles of art. So your book breaks this down that there are 3 basic styles of art, and I would argue that there are 4. So there are no, I'm not like necessarily adding information or giving you information that's not in the book, but I am telling you that this one, Stylized, which your book just kind of uses as a secondary to abstract, it's kind of like in your book, this is kind of like a subsection of abstract, I believe is its own style of art. So let's explore all of these terms with using those artworks that we just saw. So Edwin Church's Niagara is a very representational image of water and the water that flows over Niagara Falls, right? It's showing that power as that water flows over, right? And that's very representational. It's not photorealistic, but it's an obvious depiction of this, right? There's no sort of stylizing the image. And in contrast, this artwork, which is by the ancient Egyptians, is depicting water in a very different way. Let's get a different color here. Let's use a purple. All right, so here we've got this kind of line of the water where the boat rests. And then underneath of that, we see the flow of water represented by these sort of swirly waves, right? Very stylized representation of water. Very different than Edwin Church's, right? And then last but certainly not least, we have Louise Nevelson's White Vertical Water, which is another representation of water very similar to what Frederick Edwin Church was going for in his Niagara painting, but in a very different way. So it's important to note that this artwork is about 18 feet tall. That means that this side of this is larger, or roughly the size of a 2-story house. Right? And if you're a person kind of standing down here, the feeling that you're going to have looking up at this, you're going to feel sort of that power of the water, the same as Niagara would have had, right? But it's a very abstract representation of that. There is no visual cue really that this is water, other than sort of the name and sort of the shapes that are involved and kind of the way that it towers over top of you. So all 3 are depicting water, but in very different ways, in very different styles of art, right? Representational, stylized, and abstract. Now, under the heading of representational, there are 2 kind of subterms that you should know. One is trompe-l'oeil and the other is naturalistic. So this is the representational naturalistic example from your book. This is just a slightly different version than the one that you see in the book, just to give you a little bit more context. And what makes this naturalistic is the specifics of it, right? So we know that this is a representational image of the head of the king, and not just a general term, right? It's not just a male figure with a crown on, right? That's a king. Right? No, this is a very specific ruler, right? We see his individual features, right? The space between his eyes. It's a very individual, naturalistic representation of this one individual, not a generalized king, but a very specific king. Next is trompe-l'oeil. So trompe-l'oeil is a French term, which means to fool the eye, right? So there's a little bit of kind of trickery almost involved in trompe-l'oeil. So this is representational trompe-l'oeil, and this is The House Painter by Dwayne Hansen. And this entire thing that you see here is all set up. That is a wax individual or a multitude of materials used to create this artwork, right? But it's almost like if you were to just walk in there, you could almost start a conversation. If you just saw this out of the corner of your eye, or even as you walked up to it, it is like extreme realism, right? Meant to fool you, meant to deceive you, which is exactly what trompe-l'oeil is. It's meant the deception of the eye. All right. Next from representational is what we talked about was stylized, right? So stylized is, I think of stylized as the space in between representational and abstract, right? Something can be mostly representational and slightly stylized all the way to almost complete abstraction. So stylized is like the range in between. So let's look at some examples of stylized and abstract. Right. This is the Great Wave off the shore at Kanagawa. This is a Japanese woodblock print, and it does an incredible example of showing stylized waves, right? So it's not that this artist could not accurately depict the waves, that the way that they crash is that they chose to give them kind of this menacing arc to them as they crash over top of these small boats that are in the ocean, right? It's conveying that power and that sort of, well, really just that power, that fear, that kind of menacingness that the ocean has. Okay. Next, we're looking at an abstract artwork by Louise Bourgeois, and this is Woman with Packages, right? So you can see how there's like, it's stripping away this abstract artwork. This one, and if we also compare it to Louise Nevelson's artwork, right, there's this kind of stripping away of all of the details and whatnot that go along with it until you're kind of left with this almost unrecognizable, is this a woman with packages, or is this just sort of like a soft assemblage of rounded wood? Right? So that's what abstract is. Abstract is stripping away all of those details, all of those representational kind of things that make something photorealistic, the difference between, you know, sort of a cartoon hand and a real hand, right? As you go more and more and more abstract, you get more and more stylized until you reach abstraction. But one thing to note about abstraction, which differentiates it from the next thing that we're going to talk about, is the fact that abstraction has source material. This is a woman with packages. We may not have any details or information about this woman or the packages or anything like that, but we know that that is the source material. That's different than non-representational or non-objective artwork, which does not have like a reference it does not have a source material. There's no referential information for this. And this is kind of a newer thing in art history, right? When we get to that section of this class, we won't talk a lot about non-representational work until kind of the contemporary-ish time. So let's break down. Also to note, this is sometimes referred to as non-objective. That's the term that I used and I learned about, so I'll probably say that rather than non-representational. So this is the example, or one of the examples of non-representational artwork in your book. This is Tara Donovan's work. This is called Untitled. Just so you know, this is not the image, the exact image that you see in the book. I added this other one just to give context, just to give shape, those kinds of things, giving you guys more examples of the same thing. So Tara Donovan is not, when she went to create this artwork, she is not thinking about pollen or bacteria or growth of some kind of specific thing, right? That's never where the source comes from for these artworks. She makes a lot of artworks using kind of like found objects and common objects with a multitude of them. So one of her more famous artworks is all these straws packed against the wall, and there's so many straws that it's almost like you're not even looking at straws anymore. And that's kind of the same thing that's going on here. So this is just mylar and hot glue is all this artwork is. She's also famously used like styrofoam cups and other kind of things like that. And when you kind of amass them together, they kind of take on this new image. So again, the big thing that makes it important is that there's no source material. She is not trying to represent pollen or bacteria. That is not where this artwork is coming from. That's not the source material. And that's what makes it non-objective or non-representational. All right, next we're going to talk about materials and techniques. And the choice of materials and techniques is very important to artists, especially today. It always was important, but I think today we're going to learn about installation, and that really pushes the choice of materials and techniques to a new level. So first we're talking about The Kiss by Rodin. So this is a white marble sculpture, and the technique is carving. This is a very common in Western art traditions to use white marble. It's very, it has historical value to it, this material does. And the place that it's coming from is it's bringing all of this art history along with it. But let's talk about installation now. So installation is something that's a little bit more, a little bit newer in art history. So this is putting an emphasis on the location in which art is made or set up, and how that location can bring meaningfulness and bring more content to the artwork. So this is Kara Walker's work. These are not the same images that are in your book for this artwork, but I'm adding these to give more context to the artworks that we're exploring. So I could not fit the entire title onto the slide, so I'm going to read it to you now. At the behest of Creative Time, Kara E. Walker has confected a subtlety, or the marvelous sugar baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet taste from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. So that is a very long title, but it is very important. This work is loaded with content. So in Brooklyn in 2014, they were going to demolish the old refining plant for Domino sugar. So Kara Walker chose this location for her installation. And what we're looking at here is a large sphinx, which is made out of sugar and resin, and I think the core of it might be a little bit of like styrofoam to kind of hold the weight of it up and whatnot. And it's meant to look like a sphinx that's also meant to look like a Aunt Jemima or a mammy, right, who would cook sweets and cakes and confections and whatnot. And then also these other smaller kind of children figures, which are called sugar babies, are made out of molasses. And due to the humidity in the air, they actually kind of melted down, and that's why in some other images, in some of the images, or one of the images in the book, you can kind of see streams of that molasses as it runs. So what I want you guys to know is the materials, right? Using sugar, using molasses to make this statement or this content about this historical object, right? Sugar, the refining of sugar, people, workers, and place are all kind of aligning perfectly to make this social statement that's coming from this artwork. It would not be the same if Kara Walker had installed these exact same sculptures in, say, a vacant Kmart. All right, it would not hold the same content. It would not hold the same weight as doing it in the Domino sugar refining plant that's about to be demolished. So that's installation in a nutshell, and how much materials and choosing materials can add to a work of art. So there's probably going to be a test question about this artwork. All right, next I'm going to introduce a couple terms to you guys, which is form, media, right, which is media and medium. Medium is the plural of media, and that's the material used. So the medium for the sugar baby from the last slide was molasses, and I think some resin and some other materials were in there also. Then style and composition. Composition is the organization of the principles and elements of design. Chapters 4 and 5 will be completely devoted to the principles and elements. So again, these vocabulary words are building on to each other. But right now we're going to talk about how some of these things can all kind of come together and influence how art can influence other art. Okay, so this is Hairdressing by Udamaro and A Woman Having Her Hair Combed by Degas. So on the face, these artworks look very, very different and very similar, right? Their subject matter is obviously very similar. Both are one woman having her hair combed by another woman in sort of a dressing routine, right? They're very stylized, but in very different ways, right? So just so you guys know, the artwork by Udamaro directly influenced the artwork by Degas. So in 1886, Degas would have had access to a print of this, at the time, which would have been like 100 years old, Japanese artwork. So he would have had access to that, and it directly influenced his choices for this painting, not just in the subject matter, but also in some of the other more subtle things that are going on. Sort of the placements, right? At both images, you kind of have a slight vantage point, like you are above looking down at both of these scenes, right? The woman who's doing the combing of the hair is kind of behind in the same way. There's kind of the same distances. The fabrics are very important. So there's all this fabric that's being illustrated here and then also here. So artwork sometimes feeds itself or influences itself. But what's important to note is that both of these artworks, although similar and although very different, are reflective of the time and place in which they were made. Degas is not copying this artwork by Udamaro. He's looking at it and being influenced by it, but he's still using the materials, right? Oil paint, and sort of everything from his own time and place. His own influences are coming together. It's not copying. It's not like photocopying and just sort of replicating an image. It's incorporating new ideas in. Let's move on to some more vocabulary terms. All right. So understanding art is a cultural skill that must be learned. Right? And most of this class, all of art appreciation is going to be learning to understand art and that cultural skill. So here are some more vocabulary terms, which is embodied meaning. I think that's a lengthy term that your book uses, which it could just be shortened to meaning. And then form, the way an artwork looks. Content is the subject matter, and the subject matter can have a specific message that it's conveying to you, or it can just be kind of like a general idea, right? Both of those artworks of the women wearing or having their hair combed have the same subject matter, right? And so thus they have the same content, but they have very different forms, etc., etc. All right. The next terminology that I'm going to introduce to you guys is iconography. This is going to become a lot more relevant when we get into chapter 3. So what iconography is it's the reading of symbols in an artwork that requires specific knowledge of the belief structures or the time and place. So if you're thinking to yourself, what does that mean? Let's go to some examples and break it down. So here we have two examples. One is the statue of the Buddha. So let's use that one first. So how do we know that this is Buddha and not some other figure in history, right? Well, we can use the iconography. Buddha is always depicted with these long, elongated earlobes, right? This hand gesture is almost always present, especially in Zen Buddhism, which is where this artwork comes from. There's also this kind of like bun type thing on top of the head, which again is very specific to Zen Buddhism, but usually there's kind of this bun on top of the head of the Buddha, and then the depiction of the third eye here. So all of these things, the hand gesture, the earlobes, I don't want to say hairstyle, but the hair and the representation of the third eye lead us to know that this is Buddha and not a other character, right? And the consistency of using that hand gesture, those earlobes, that thing, all the consistency of using that over and over again makes it part of the iconographical identity of the Buddha, specifically in Zen Buddhism. Let's move over here to this depiction of Mary in the Ascension, right? So part of Mary's, right, Jesus's mother's iconographical identity is that she's always has this blue on, right? So blue historically was a color that was it was a very difficult color to achieve, and you had to send away for the materials for it for very far away to the Middle East, right? And during the Renaissance, that would be something that would be very expensive. So you couldn't use a whole lot of blue, but you wanted to really devote it to characters or to parts of an image that it really, really needed, right? And this is different. This is a little bit more art history than you guys need at the moment, but it is important to note that that's part of Mary's iconographical identity, right? The blue, right? She's always going to be the woman. Usually she's going to have a baby in her lap. At this moment she doesn't, but she'll have, Jesus will be somewhere nearby or whatnot. And then she always has blue on, which I think is symbolic of the like kind of sadness that's going to happen in her life, right? But that is part of her iconographical identity. That's how we know as a viewer, us, others, people of the time and place who could not read, right? That's how they know who Mary was in the image. It wouldn't have done any good to label her, like write Mary and then put a little arrow pointing to her, because most people could not read. So iconography requires knowledge of the group, right? Whether it's Zen Buddhism or Christianity, you have to have an understanding and a knowledge of the belief structures and what these symbols are and what they mean to different groups, right? You might be more familiar with sort of Christianity, so we know who these characters are because of their wings, right? We don't think that they're just like cupids, right? That's from a totally different religious group, right? We know them as angels, not as cupids, right? So some good examples there. All right. This brings us to a test question, which is going to lead us towards chapter 3. So I'm going to present, this is one of the questions that you guys will have on the quiz. So context is a factor that ties and binds a work of art to what? All right. So the answer is all of the above. And so all of the above are important in understanding the context of a work of art. So chapter 3 is going to be about breaking down that context through different lenses, right? The biographical lens, which is the life of the creator, the audience who the artwork is made for, and what kind of communication or dialogue is being created through that, the society in which art is made, right? The belief structure, right? Iconography, right? So that's kind of a religious context or a religious type of analysis. So that's leading us into chapter 3. Here are your key terms. If you have any questions, please email me and reference back to the video if you need it. Thank you. Have a good one.